Welcome to lesson 8 on exceptions, closing resources and dealing with resource leaks. In this video we continue where we left off in lesson 7. What we'll do is we'll refactor our existing code. Then we'll look at simpler ways in closing our resources by making use of the try with resource statement that was introduced in Java 7. We'll also look at the rules when applying the try with resources. We'll discuss two very important interfaces with regards to try with resources statement, namely the java.lang.AutoCloseable and the java.nio.file interfaces. I hope you enjoy this, and don't forget to subscribe and so on. So let's get to it. Okay, carry on from lesson 7. I want to show you something over here. If you look at this code here in test 2, I'm adding 2 to the counter, wrongly thinking that when I write the line and I call new line first and then write the line, it's actually adding 2 lines, and that's not so, because the read line there, if you go and read what is the read line, it says here it reads a line of text that is and the line is considered to be terminated when it finds a new line or a carriage return and so on. But further it says the string containing the contents of the line does not include the line termination. So that's why the new line is added here, because this will just be a long straight line of lines. It reads the line, it sees when it's got a new line, it will read the next line, but it doesn't include the new line termination in it, and that's why a person has to call a new line here to add a termination. But in actual fact this would be 1. So the counter here should be incremented by 1 every time, and then over here this multiplication there is no, because I just want to flush every 1000. Okay, so if I go and save this and run it now, let's see what happens. If you see previously it flushed 3 times, and let's see what happens now. It's still flushing 3 times. Okay, and then if I go and just refresh this, let's see if my backed file, it is there, and there's no additional line. So just a fix on that. Remember that the read line reads a line, and when it sees a line termination, reads the next line, but all continuously. That's why on each line that is reading, when I'm writing, I'm adding a new line here. So this new line actually counts as 1 line, otherwise it would be in a continuous line all the time. Okay, so yeah, and then well, I would have to do the same with my test 3, and just to show you, I'm actually calling test 2 over here. Test 3, I would also change this code here to just add 1 to the counter, and then I would take that one out. And if we test this, I'm just going to delete that over there, and then I will call test 3 instead of test 2. So I'll comment that one out, do that, let's run it. We're using the IDEs. So what I actually wanted to see here is refresh it, and there's Alice back, and that's working fine. Okay, now looking at this code, you'll agree with me that the code to close the resources can still be quite complex, because you've got to put it in your finery, and if you've got more than one resource, you've got to guard against null and then catch that exception, but make sure that you handle the closing of the next one irrespective of the previous one being thrown an exception or not. And now, before, I believe Java 8, this was the case. Now, in Java 8, they introduced what they call try-with-resources. And I'm going to show you an example of this, and I'm going to use the same example. I'm going to call it test 4, but I'm going to leave out the flush just to make it easier and more compact, because we know, and you guys won't, you can add the flush in the code yourself. You can go and download the code and just add it there. That will be a nice test for you. And I wrote a little code here, test 4, where I'm using where I'm using close with resources. And if you look at this code, what's happened to my close? Where am I closing my resources? Okay, what's happening in this code? You'll see the try here. I'm adding the buffered reader, my streams, my buffered reader and buffered writer inside brackets. You see, here's the bracket there and over there. So all my resources I initialize and I add inside this bracket when at the beginning of the try declaration, where you will see the previous one didn't have that bracket. You see, I had to initialize it to null and then assign it on the inside of the brackets. This there's no brackets, and this one here I'm doing it inside, and then I'm just closing it, and I'm throwing an exception here for close. Now in Java 8 they introduced a try with resources way, and take note, any class that extends, or not extends, that implements the AutoCloseable interface. So the classes must implement the AutoCloseable interface, can then use try with resources. Now the close method is called automatically when it comes to the end, and the close method could throw an IO exception, and that's why I'm saying that I'm declaring to throw it here, otherwise I would have to have a catch here. Now I just want to show you, if I go to my buffered reader and open it, you will see that the buffered reader, previously just the closable, but now it also implements the AutoCloseable. Now the AutoCloseable is got a close method. Okay, just like the close, but this one is used with the close with resources, and it was actually added, as you can see, in 1.7, Java 1.7, not 1.8 like I said earlier on. Okay, so 1.7 I introduced the AutoCloseable, and you will see that the closable now, its subclasses the AutoCloseable. Its subclasses. Let's just go to, there it is, closable. See, so you get now closable down here that implements, that extends AutoCloseable. Okay, so now you don't have to worry about writing this code here in the finally block. It gets handled for you, and the main thing here is you have to put this try in brackets. You have to initialize and declare an initialize inside here, otherwise you'll get a compiler error, and then you basically, I'm reading and writing here. I don't need a finalize and to check all of that. So let's just see if I run this. So I'm calling it here. I'm just taking out the stats since I'm not implementing I'm not using the flush, not the flush. Then try test 4. So I'm calling test 4 and I'm catching the exception. Yeah, if it did throw an exception. So just going to delete this file. I'm sure that file must be unhappy or been deleted so many times already, but let's go. Okay, so I've got no errors. So let's just see if I refresh. There's my file, and there everything's working 100%. Okay, let's look at, just revise the try catch finally that we had previously. Okay, and what you can see here, you got the try. Before the try, you would usually declare your resources you're going to use, like your buffer, reader and writer, and initialize them to null. And then you'd actually initialize them in the try block, and if anything happens, you'd catch the specific exceptions here, and then finally used to wrap up critical things like closing your resources and so on. Now that's the try catch finally before Java 7. Now Java 7 introduced the try with resources, and yeah, I've got the sketch of what happened. So in your try, in your try, you initialize your resource, you declare it, and you initialize in your try all your resources in a bracket, and then you would use it here, and when it closes here, it would then when it comes here, it will call the AutoCloseable or the closable interface. Now note that this buffered reader and any resource that you're using has to implement the AutoCloseable interface or its subclass, the closable interface. Now you can also have a catch or more than one catch and a final here, but the close method is called implicitly, irrespective of if the IO exception is called, an exception is called, or the finally. So when it comes here, your close method of your closable or your AutoCloseable will be called. And we'll look at some of those examples. Okay, so let's test some of the rules or what we can do with try with resources. To do that, and also to see how it works. Okay, so to do that, I've created a class, a very simple class called myResource. So I'm simulating a resource like a file, but just to see the mechanics, I'm just calling it myResource. And I've got a public void close method, and I'm printing out system out print line 2. So if the close method gets called, 2 will be printed. Okay. Then I've got a method called test5, and here I'm putting the try in try with resources, and you can identify that because I've got my resources declared and initialized in the bracket of the try. Now immediately you can see I've got a problem here. It doesn't want to compile, and that's because if we highlight it there, you'll see it must implement the AutoCloseable interface. So it's telling me my resource is not doesn't implement the AutoCloseable interface. So let's just go and implement the AutoCloseable. Implements the AutoCloseable interface, and you see that error is gone. Now the AutoCloseable has got one method that you must override, and it's been overridden here. So if I misspelled it and I say closes, then you will see the the close method hasn't been implemented. Now, not part really of this, but it's always good to put an @override annotation, and that helps you identify that this method is not an override method because it's spelled wrong as well. So just going to fix it there, and you see it's all nice. Okay, so I'm calling test 5 over here. So what's happening is the compile error is no longer there. It's happy with my resource file, and in my resource file it's going to print 1. Now you see I'm not calling close anywhere. So what will happen if I call close? If I run this, is it going to print 1? Is it going to print what? 1 and 2? What's it going to do? Okay, so let's just run this. I'm just going to run it quickly. And you see it printed 1, and it automatically called the close method of my resource class because it implements AutoCloseable. I could also just implement its subclass, which is Closeable, and if I run it now, you'll see it compiles and it's fine. So it can be AutoCloseable or a subclass, and we know Closeable is one of the subclasses. Okay, so as I mentioned before, as you can see here, I mentioned that even though the try with resources calls the implicit finally, which is it calls the close method in the AutoCloseable or Closeable, you can still add one or more catch blocks and a finally block. So let's test this out quickly and see how it works. Okay, so I modified, or I added a catch, and I put the caught exception IO exception E, and in each block I'm printing 3, and in the finally I've added a final as well. I'm printing 4. But you'll see I also print 1 here, and then I call throw a new exception. So what happens, it will print 1, then it will throw an exception. Will it print 3, 4? What about when it reaches here, the AutoCloseable, the close method is called? What will happen in this case? Because you'll see my AutoCloseable prints 2. Okay, in this case the Closeable, which is a subclass of AutoCloseable, a sub interface. Okay, so let's go and look at that. Is it going to print 1, 3, 4, or 1, 3, 4, 2, or 1, 3, 2, 4, and so on? We can think of all the combinations, but what is the actual result? So let's go and run it quickly, and you'll see it printed 1. So it printed this one, and when it came to the it throws a new IO exception, but then it comes here, and before it executes the IO exception or the catch block, before it executes a catch block, it goes and prints 2. So it does the close method first, then it comes back and it does all the catch blocks and the finally block. Okay, what I've done in my resource class, I've added a public hello method, and if I call it, it will imprint my resource diz olá, which means I say hello in Portuguese. Okay, so let's go and look what happens if I use it. Okay, yeah, I've called resource hello, and actually what I want to show you, if I take it and I had to put it after the IO exception, the compiler would give an error because it's unreachable, meaning that once an exception is thrown, it comes to this line, to the catch, so this could never happen because I'm programmatically throwing an exception there. So I'm just going to move it back to where it was, and let's see what happens if I run it. And it prints 1. The resource hello gets called. This method here gets called. It prints my resource these all are, and then an exception is thrown, but the close method is called, which prints 2, followed by the catch, which prints 3 and 4. So that's working 100%. But what will happen if I also want to call this resource hello, say, in the catch? And you see I've got a compile error there. And if I put it in the finally, I've also got a compile error. The problem is that whatever you declare your resources, any resource that you declare that implements AutoCloseable or closable, as we said, is bound, is scope bound. It's bound to this code here, that code there. So you cannot use it anywhere else. So in the same sense, you would not be able to call the resource close method anywhere else like this. That won't also work, although you could call it over here. Okay, then it would have called close twice there. So let's just take it out here. And I'm going to take it out over here and call the close again. And you'll see in my example, the close was called there and it was called again when it reached the thing. But what's important to note here is that your variable, your reference variable of your resource is scope bound to your try. So you wouldn't use it anywhere else outside it. Now, if you look at this, we've called close here. And we know that it's implicitly called here as well when it reaches the end. And that's why it's printed twice. But it just does not make sense. Why would we try and close something twice? Why would we call close twice? Okay, so the close method in Closeable, one of its properties is that it is required to be idempotent, meaning that once you've called the close once, it shouldn't, if you call it again, it should have no effect on it. It shouldn't try and close it again. Now let's try and do that with our class over here. So I'm going to change the code so that to try and make it idempotent. And you'll see what I've done is in my no argument construct, and I'm sure there's many other ways of doing this, I've assigned the object that's created this to the variable resource. So I'm keeping track of the resource that was created, the object in other words. Then in my close, I test first to see if the resource is null. If it's null, then I just return. If it's not null, I would close, which I'm going to print 2 so we can see what happens. And then the resource gets initialized to null, so it closes it. Okay, so let's see what happens if I run this. If you can see, I had 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, and that 2 comes because I'm calling close here, and then when it reaches here, it tries and closes my resource again. So let's run it. And you see now, even though I'm calling close here and I'm calling close there, I'm actually only closing it once, the next time it comes here, it would see that it's null and it just returns. Okay, if we go and look at the implementation class, let's say buffered reader, and we go and look, you see they've also got a reference variable of reader and it's defaulted to null. If you don't give it anything, it's null because it's an object. And if I go and look at the close method implementation, you'll see, okay, apart from it being synchronized and it's throwing IO exception, you'll see it checks if it's null. If it's null, it will return, otherwise it will call the reader's close. Okay, and then it's got a finally, if it crashes, it will make it null. So that is idempotent. Now, what will happen if my resources that implements closable or auto-closable, in this case closable, what will happen if, say, I declare to throw a checked exception here? Okay, I'm going to leave this class as it is so that you guys got it, but I'm going to have another class here called another resource, and yeah, I'm implementing closable, and I didn't I left the IO exception, throws IO exception. So I'm declaring that I throw an IO exception. And then I'm actually going to throw a new IO exception, error when trying to close. Now, what will happen if I use this in a try with resources? Remember that the close is called automatically. But now I'm throwing exception. What will happen? Okay, so yeah, in test 6, I've declared a resource, another, and it's going to close, and it's going to call close, the close method here that's going to throw a caught exception. And remember, excuse me, the caught exception has to be caught or handled, declared or handled. So it's giving me a compiler error, so I have to, when my close method throws an exception, I have to handle it. So I could either declare to throw it to the client, or in this case I'm going to put it in a catch, and I'm going to say it's an IO exception, so I'm going to catch a specific, the most specific exception in this case, which is IO exception, and yeah, I'm going to say, I'm just going to print the message. System dot out dot print line say get message. Okay, so let's see now it's not complaining anymore. And what happens if I now run it? I'm going to compile it and run it, and let's see, an error when trying to close. So the message, you see the message of the exception, is this one here. So I threw the exception and I caught it here, and then I printed the message. So if your close method is going to throw a caught or checked exception, in other words, then I have to handle it or declare it. I could have said, yeah, throws an IO exception and have it handled in the main method. Okay. Also take note that the finally would be executed irrespective, but note that if I just use a finally, I've still got a problem here. Remember, the finally doesn't catch your exceptions. It's to do anything after whatever you've done. So the finally won't solve my problem. I still have to put a catch here to catch this exception that's been declared to be thrown here, and it is actually throwing one. Okay, now let's look at another situation. Say there's more than one exception thrown. Like in this case here, in another resource, in the try block, I'm throwing an IO exception in try block. and then the end of this, the close method will be called of another resource, and you'll see the close method of another resource also throws an IO exception. Which one will be caught here and printed? Let's have a look at this. Exception in try block. So the rule says if more than one exception is thrown, the main exception will be the one that will be called. The first exception, in other words, is known as the main exception, or the primary exception will be called. Okay, let's look at this example. Yeah, I've got a class called Karu, which stands for car, and it implements AutoCloseable. And I've got a string named Tipu, means type, and then in the Karu, in the constructor, I will then initialize whatever I pass this type of the car, and then it's got a close method. Under the close method, it will throw an exception, and the message will be the type of the vehicle, lançou uma exceção, which means it threw an exception. So if it's an say a Peugeot, it will say Peugeot through an exception, lançou uma exceção. Okay, so what will happen in the case which I've got here in test 7, what I've done here is I've actually got two instances of this Karu class. So I'm creating two instances, which is in a try with resources, and then I'm going to catch it. Which one of the two will be caught? Remember, we know that the primary one will be caught because there's more than one, but which one of the two will be caught? Okay, let's have a look at that. And you see that the last one, in this case the second one, but another rule is that when at the close, it closes the resources in reverse order. The last one gets closed first, and then the next one, and so on. And since the last one was the first one to close, it becomes the principal or the primary exception, and that's why it's printed there. Okay, so all that I did here on test 7 for now, I've thrown a new exception here. Eu não sou carro is the message, I am not a motor car. In the try block of the try with the resources. So this logically would be the primary exception, and then the other two would be thrown. So I should just see eu não sou carro. So let's just see what happens if it works. And yes, it's working fine. But now, what happened to the other exceptions? Because only the primary is thrown. Now, before Java 7, when the try with resources, you only had access to the one. No? But now, with Java 7, you can actually get the other exceptions. They are suppressed exceptions. They've been suppressed. So you can just, I've just put in the code. So I can now go and get all my other suppressed exceptions that have also been thrown. So let's see what happens here. We know it's in the reverse order. We know this one is in the principal in this case, because now I'm throwing this one first before the close is reached, and we know it's in reverse order. So I should see now eu não sou carro, followed by the message, the last one, Peugeot lançou exceção, and then Alfa Romeo lançou uma exceção. Okay, and yeah, you'll see the code. I put it in a for loop, and the get suppression returns, as you can see, an array of type throwable, which is a superclass of all exceptions, and this is a method to get them, get suppressed. Then I'm using the throwable to print out the message over there. So I'm going to run it, and there it is. The main message was thrown first and caught, and the other two suppressed exceptions in reverse order. In other words, the last resource is closed first, and then the second last to the last, so first and so on. Let's recap the rules we've dealt with in the try with resources statement. In a try catch finally statement, you must have at least one or more catch blocks and or a finally block. It means that you could have a catch block or a finally block or both. With a try with resources, this is still true. You just don't have to type it. The finally is implicit. You may still add one or more catch blocks and or a finally block. Even if you add a catch or finally, the close method is still called automatically. The resources created in the try clause are only in scope within the try block. You can't just put a random class in the try with resource statement. Remember, it needs to implement the AutoCloseable. The closable required is implemented to be, in other words, closable is required to be idempotent, the implementation of the closable. If a resource declares to throw a checked exception, this you must handle or declare it. If more than one exception is thrown, then the primary exception is thrown. The other exceptions are suppressed. Resources are closed in reverse order. Okay, it was quite a long lesson. By the way, there's a new episode of That Resident Girl. So now that you've watched this video, I'm sure you guys need a relaxing break. Go and watch that. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel by pressing the subscribe button, a like if you liked it, comments and so on. And I've also got a Facebook page related to this channel, so check that one out as well. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lesson.